All right. Hey, Dinesh, I just started recording. For those of you who haven't seen, Dinesh is my longtime mentor, friend, ex-boss. And in the previous video, we were chatting about Incerto idea, how to win, thinking about your mental models. And, we tried to race through it. And I think there's a bunch of stuff that's worth following up on. So I think today we decided to chat about frames. And Dinesh, you want to share like why you think we decided to talk about frames?
Yeah, I guess there's this tweet thread that you did some time back, and there's an interesting idea there about how a lot of problems in the world are the result of maybe using the wrong frame or selecting a different one. And we had a little bit of a chat after our call last week, where if you re-express that in kind of the language of Platonic forms, you could see that there's kind of a parallel between a frame and a Platonic form, right? And maybe you can speak a little bit about that thread. What prompted you to write that, and then we can connect that to what we were talking about last week.
Wait, first, would you want to recap what you mean by a Platonic form?
Sure. So, I mean, what's a Platonic form, or why do you need it, right? So the underlying idea there is just that there's this infinitely complex reality. Again, so Neil deGrasse Tyson said something like, the universe is under no obligation to make sense to you. So it's very unlikely that the universe was shaped around us, so we just exist in it. And so there's this infinitely complex universe, and what we're trying to do is to make sense of it. We're kind of doing dimensionality reduction, so we're trying to interpret reality via these Platonic forms or mental models, these simplified representations of reality. So I mean, it's a lot like a 2D a 2D kind of creature trying to understand a 3D object, right? You take slices of it, or you look at it in different angles. There's this visualized value tweet, I think a couple of months ago, where there's this kind of a pyramid 3-dimensional structure, but then truth can be either, if you look at it from the top, it's like concentric circles. If you look at it from the side, it's just different lines. So I think that's a good way to kind of think about it, that there's this underlying reality, and the Platonic form is just kind of a consistent explanation, a consistent story you can tell about this infinitely complex reality that you're trying to simplify. Right. And so that's, you can kind of connect that to frame, right? That kind of is a parallel notion in frames, because a frame is really, you're trying to look at the things you're doing in a particular way.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, I actually have I just remember I can't reach it, but I have a literal photo frame that's empty. That's just a frame, just to remind myself. And so I guess I'll move to talking about what I mean by frames. So yeah, I have a thread. It starts with, thank you, Mario, but the root of our problem is in another castle. And that's remixing the code that you get when you finish a stage in Mario. Anyway, so the idea of frames, right? So even in video, it's like anytime you take a photograph, like, so the frame of this video screen, right, is here, but there's more reality outside the frames, right? It's just that for the purpose of making a video, that's the thing that we have choose to frame things by. And the idea is that we're always framing things all the time, whether we want to or we don't. It's just human, like what you're saying as well. It's like human attention is such that it has to operate within some boundaries, or we can't make sense of anything. And a lot of problems are misframed. And the Alan Watts quote that I like to use is that problems that are persistent and insoluble should always be, and that's a heuristic as well, right? But like, it should always be suspected of having been improperly framed. I'm probably butchering the quote, but the idea again is that, like, someone thinks that they have some problem, and then they want to try and solve that problem by addressing what they think the problem is, but it turns out that the actual problem is outside the frame, right? So it's somewhere else. And so one way of thinking about this, we come with metaphors, right? So like, oh, maybe the problem is upstream, and that's using the frame or a story of a literal river as a way of trying to simplify and understand, like, oh, there's an upstream problem, and you cannot solve a problem downstream without addressing the upstream causes. So if there's like pollution coming down from upstream, whatever you do to try and, you can try and like filter the water or whatever, but unless you address the pollution, the source of the pollution, it's not going to fix it. And it's just, as I was writing my book and just thinking about stuff, thinking about my own life, doing reading, talking to people, whatever, I just find that a lot of, it's really true, it seems to be true that a lot of problems are misframed. And so anecdotally, the thing that I mentioned to you at the end of our last chat, or after our last chat, was that I have a friend, let me try and anonymize this a little bit, but like, so they had a issue with dating, right? So they felt that they were interested in a particular kind of person, and they assumed that that particular type of person would not be interested in someone like them. So they felt miserable. They're like, oh, I'm never going to be able to find a partner who likes people like me, who like just physically, you know, let's say she's blonde, right? Just a random, and she assumes that, oh, she likes brunette men or men with brown hair, and she assumes that, oh, like all men with brown hair only like other, you know, that sounds absurd when you put it that way, but when you think about things like conventional attractiveness, body image, face, like a lot of people do assume that, oh, attractive people seem to date other attractive people. Like if you see the media, you see every attractive person that you can think of seems to be dating other attractive people. And so attractive people only want conventionally physically attractive people only want to be with other conventionally physically attractive people. Well, that's not the actual thing, but like, let's just assume is that. And it turns out that she was wrong. It turns out that she managed to find someone who was that she found attractive, who was attracted to her. And that person's existence breaks her preconceived notion. Like, so she assumed, she was framing a world in which everyone inside this attractive land is only attracted to other people also, but there are people outside the frame, but she couldn't perceive it because we can't perceive what's outside the frame, right? Literally, if I go out of, no, now you can't see my face, but that doesn't mean that my face disappeared, right? Like we know that with cameras, we know, but like we don't feel that to be true with these like idea boundaries of what is possible and what is not possible. And yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I guess, you know, the whole point of, I mean, the reason this kind of chat was interesting is because we are applying that idea to itself, right? So, you know, this is maybe another frame you can use on that frame, on that idea of frames, to maybe make it easier for people to understand it. So one thing is, so with kind of frames in social situations, you almost think that, okay, there are only maybe, you know, a couple, right, that I can possibly choose. I probably have, you know, one of the main ones, especially if it's socially accepted. But if you kind of take the parallel idea of kind of Platonic forms and reality and how you're interpreting that, if you think about kind of the crazy complexity of reality, I mean, just take, you know, especially with the Webb telescope stuff that's come on, right? So we over-index our existence on Earth, right? Yeah, you know, probably the city that you live in, the country that you live in, even if you travel a lot on Earth. But the universe is so ridiculously large that your brain really is not equipped to deal with it, right? And so you think that, okay, you know, the universe has like, you know, 1 million billion more places than I've experienced, right? Some ridiculous, arbitrary large number. But that doesn't do any kind of justice to how many places there are, that, you know, how many physical locations there are. And so in a similar way, so that's kind of a 3D area or a spatial area. Right. If you think about cognitive interpretation of reality, right? In a very similar way, we probably over-index on the frames that we do have. So we over-index on the Platonic forms we use. We over-index on the Platonic forms that is socially kind of common. And the thing is, there possibly are way more Platonic forms out there that are ways to interpret even social reality, right? Even if you kind of constrict it to just people and dating and kind of social life, there got to be a lot more different Platonic forms or mental models or frames that you can use. And so because of that, what happens is the default stance has to kind of be curiosity, right? There's no way that you can have the hubris to think that, oh, okay, so it's either the kind of the frame I have or maybe two other frames that I can choose from. You should always be wondering, okay, there's got to be a ton of frames out there that, and one, you know, the whole point of the frame is to help you achieve some outcome. And if the frame that you have is not helping you achieve the outcome, there's got to be, I mean, it's impossible to think that there isn't another one that might, given the ridiculous, complex reality that underpins everything that we try to do. And so I guess the point I'm just trying to make is that if you kind of think of it that way, you might just be a lot more open to trying different frames or thinking that there are more frames out there than then really you are over-indexing on the couple that you're using. And so that might be, a way to express this idea in a way that people are like, oh, okay. So, again, if you're stuck with, again, just the example that we're using, if you're stuck in a dating problem, the default should be, okay, wait, it's very likely that my frame is wrong. It's very likely that my platonic form is wrong, because there got to be like some ridiculous number of platonic forms out there, or frames out there that I can use, rather than, okay, it's got to either be the one I have or this other one that I've heard of. How can there be so many more? So let me just kind of stick to the one I have and muddle along, right?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So now I'm thinking about how I tried to convey the idea of frames to people in my book. One of the things I liked was in cinema, I guess photography, right? So again, like frames are very intuitive with everyone has a smartphone now, so everyone's a filmmaker, photographer, whether you realize it or not. And so even in photography, there's like, and like you mentioned the telescope, there's like, you can look at microscopic stuff like bacteria, viruses, whatever, and you can zoom all the way up to the macro and look at universe scale stuff. You can, and there's this great there's a blog post about the cinematography of The Incredibles, which is the Pixar cartoon movie, and it just shows there's close-up shots with the face, and then there's like two-person shots, and then there's like action shots from very far away, and it really just reveals the rate. Like, so even in a children's movie and cartoons, it seems simple, but once you start paying attention to how the filmmakers choose to frame their shots, so when they want to show you the shot on a person's face, they come in all the way in. When they want to show you the scale of a grand, and sometimes they switch frames very dramatically, and then that causes the viewer to feel the distance. Even in the famous Jaws scene, when the guy gets stressed, they show the camera kind of zooms in and it feels like the world is warping around him. And the idea there is that, and again, if you try to make your first film on your smartphone and you haven't thought very much about filmmaking techniques or whatever, you wouldn't even think, oh, how should I frame this shot? You might just think, I want to film two of my friends having a conversation, and then you just film them, like, both of them on screen. And it doesn't yet occur to you that, oh, I can like switch scenes from behind this person's head, and then you switch around to behind the other person's head, or you can, there's all these options that you have, and changing and so as a filmmaker, or even an amateur filmmaker, photographer, whatever, like, you start to realize that you can zoom in, zoom out, and there's all these different things you can do to switch things up, and that serve your purpose. And so this actually gets you thinking about what your purpose even is, right? Like, so if you don't realize that you can change your frame, that actually constrains your imagination to everything that's inside the frame. But once you even have two frames or like two lenses or two cameras or whatever, right? Once you have a choice between the two, then you start thinking, this seems better for that, and that seems better. This seems better in some ways, this seems better in other ways. And then you start asking yourself, which do I like better, or for whatever purpose. So like a friend of mine was recently asking, how do you explain to people what the point of the story is, right? And or the point of storytelling. And I thought about it for a while, and I realized that even the question, what is the point of X, that itself comes from within a frame. It's a utilitarian perspective of thinking, what is the point of something? Like, oh, is it satisfy me? Is it whatever? And the answer that I liked was the idea that stories are how we even conceive of how to ask questions like, what is the point of something? So it's like your sense of meaning, or your sense of, family is important, or community is important, or those things are not important. It's more important to achieve great things or whatever. Like all of these, like, it's all based on a series of priorities that some person has, and it's based on like the story that they're telling themselves, or they inherited. Maybe they watched the biography. I know I was reading Gandhi's biography, and he was talking about like reading Tolstoy, and like Tolstoy influenced Gandhi, who influenced MLK, who influenced other people. And it's really just each person. So every person, when they're whether they are writing a book or they're even having conversations with people, they're always communicating their frames, whether they realize it or not, because we have no choice, right? So whatever the words that we choose reveal our frames, right? And we can inherit each other's frames. You can be like, oh, that, like, and we don't literally say that, when we think, what I remember what Dinesh said when he said this. It's quite insightful. I think that's useful in some way. And so it's like, and to switch things up a little bit, it's like when I scroll through my Twitter timeline, which I feel I have been very careful to choose thoughtful people. Even so, I see a lot of people who are very ill-disciplined with what they choose to focus on. And it's like anybody who, and people are very suggestible, I guess, right? So, and anybody who suggests that anything just pops up on your timeline or whatever, like a lot of people feel they have an emotional response to something, and then they follow up with wanting to say something or do something, and all of that is, it's like the series of actions that follows when you don't question why you're doing it. And it is tiresome to question everything, right? But like from time to time you should anyway. I'm just rambling about this because I feel like it ties back to why we're having these conversations in the first place, which is that I witness people who are not very skilled at framing things for themselves, being deliberate about so when they use Platonic models, we can't escape using Platonic models. So you should be aware of the platonicity of the models that you're using, and you should be aware of how it could screw you, and you should be questioning it from time to time, like, oh, is this actually what I want? Is this helping me? Am I all that? And yeah, I'm just rambling at this point, but
yeah, I guess, just to touch on your filmmaker or cinematography example. So I think that's a really good analog. So the thing is, if you remove the cameras, there's some underlying really rich reality. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly it. So what a filmmaker does is it takes kind of a 2D slice of that and presents that on a screen. And you can zoom in, you can zoom out, you can change the color. There are like a million different ways you can interpret this fixed reality of just a scene. Sure. And that's really it. If you realize that, okay, I can use a whole different bunch of cameras. And again, it's like I might have one camera camera lens or one view that I use all the time, and maybe there are two others. But no, that's probably what a good filmmaker or cinematographer is. They know that there are like almost an infinite number of ways you can slice and dice that scene to evoke different emotions. And it's exactly what you said. So it's really what outcome that you're trying to achieve. And again, right, because it's kind of a spatial thing, it's easy to kind of, so what outcome? But actually, the conceptual idea is like what you mentioned. The outcome itself is a Platonic form that you are, it's another part of reality that you're trying to distill down and achieve something, right? And so, we don't have great language for, vocabulary for describing these things. But at the end of the day, it's really, I guess the way to think about it is, if you're not getting what you want, if you're not happy, if you're not winning, right, if you're not achieving whatever outcome, sure, it might be that the way you're formulating that outcome is wrong. Maybe you have a utilitarian lens that you're looking at it and you should be looking at something else. But, whatever the case, if you feel some emotion that is undesired and it's not working, I guess one thing that if you're not already doing, that should be your first thing to look at is, okay, wait a minute. So am I using the right lens? Am I using the right kind of mental model or the form, right? Because there might be a ton of them. And, what you said earlier about how you might see people who kind of get stuck in these, who don't have kind of a hygienic idea of these Platonic forms, how it impacts them. To some extent, one is it's somewhat understandable because this is what education should be, but it's not, right? Education is nobody prepares you for this. And also, if something is really socially accepted, right? If there's a Platonic form that everybody uses, you need to have either a lot of confidence in yourself, or you need to be trained to, or have some kind of foundation for saying that, wait a minute, okay, so everybody's using this form, but this doesn't work for me for whatever reason, or isn't helping me achieve my outcome. What about this other form, right? And so, the selection and, using the right Platonic form for you, that is what education should be, right? But we don't have that. And so it's unsurprising. And, again, yeah, like you mentioned, this potentially the hope of chats like this is to maybe provide an alternative frame of thinking about education, or thinking about how you achieve outcomes and the different things that can impact that. And, there's almost a tragic, and maybe we can keep this for another chat, but there's like a tragic spread of, maybe not damaging models, but, models that aren't useful. And part of the reason, again, for that is, we talked about a little about it in the last chat, but models that reach you through social media are really optimized for spread rather than usefulness to your context. And that's like such a great tragedy. And that compounded with the fact that the ones that are optimized for spread a lot, and so achieve social consensus. So you now have like two, it's a double whammy, right? The models you see are the ones that are optimized for spreading, and the ones that are optimized for spreading are the ones that everybody talks about. So can you blame them for thinking that this flawed model that isn't useful to them is the one that they stick to? I mean, it's unsurprising at all, right? They should be it's unsurprising at all that that happens, and it's a tragedy, right? And I mean, I guess at some point we'll fix this and reform education, or
Yeah, we really so the social media stuff, it really optimizes for sloganeering, right? So, and like abolish X, or believe Y, and this is easy to spread. Going back to education, I have like a radical view. I have a radical version of how I think about it, and I mean, I don't always talk about it in these terms, but again, it depends on who you're talking to, I guess. But like the sort of strong version of the hypothesis, for depending on how ready the person is to consider this idea, right? But like, so not only is school bad at teaching people how to switch frames, the sort of cynical, slightly dark view is that school itself is a system of indoctrination, right? So, and what is indoctrination? Is literally you are establishing the mainstream frame for everyone by almost by force, whether it's coercion or implicit, and even if it's non-coercive, right? So even if you have really good teachers, which again we can't guarantee, and I definitely appreciate the struggle that, like, doing mainstream education for an entire country, for example, is a incredibly difficult thing to try and standardize some kind of syllabus and whatnot. But when you have classrooms and people competing with each other on standardized tests, and just everything about what makes school work kind of reinforces this frame of so one of the many things it does is it discourages like collaboration, like you're in contest with everyone else, and that could be just a completely arbitrary, it's a frame that gets put on. They do want, like, if you ask any teacher, they will say that, oh yeah, I want my kids to be good collaborators. Ask any parent, they'll be like, oh yeah, I want my kids to be able to work with other people. But just as a sort of auxiliary or unintended consequence of standardized testing, just so that we can have some system of assessment, people spend 10 plus years of their lives working on like solo tests, and then when they go out into the world, even if they intellectually know that, oh yeah, the world is not like school, like you've just, in so many years of habit of working on the test. Same for, and I know Bezos has a quote that's like once in a while, like on a test, you can score up to 100. That's it, like 0 to 100, 0 to 100, which is it's a mediocristan thing, right? Whereas in the real world, like you might score 0, 0, 0, 0, and then like 100 million, right? And it's worth, if you can afford to score zeros for a few years and then you score your million, like that, then you're set. But like, again, people's intuitions are not calibrated for that, because there's no way that any child can score 1 million on a test. And maybe that's part of like, and so when I talk to educators, like people who work in schools, teachers, stuff, I'm always a bit wary, because it's very difficult. While individual teachers who are thoughtful typically appreciate these things, like the systems that they're working in is very, very difficult to reform, because like, the parents, all kinds of different parents want different things, and they want innovation, but they want things to be done stable and predictable and no risk, and that's just very difficult. So I think the best way to try and reform education for the species at large, right, is to have pockets of, and I mean, we're doing it right now by having conversations about it, right, to have pockets of spaces where individuals can individuals can experiment with frames, right, demonstrate to each other how they're doing things differently, and if it works, it will succeed and there'll be better outcomes, right? So people are doing well, and then that will be that can spread. It won't spread as fast as slogans, but I think if we have enough thoughtful people who are trying to make a visible public effort to spread good thinking and good practices, epistemic hygiene, I mean, again, there's no certainty that it will work, but it's what we want to do, and it's thoughts.
Yeah, I guess what I would say about that is, I would zoom out, and I think a lot of the problems with educational discourse is there's one Platonic form or one mental model that's applied to how education has evolved, right? And the thing is, the problem with the word education is it's a very loaded word, right? It has, everybody looks at it and thinks a different way. And I used to be frustrated at education before, but if you look at it in terms of, okay, the person who designed a curriculum or designed the system had a particular outcome that they want to achieve. And going back to our Platonic forms kind of conversation, right? The different Platonic forms aren't, different mental models aren't necessarily good or bad, right? There's, the quote we mentioned the last time, you can't charisma yourself out of a physics problem, but you also can't physics yourself out of a charisma problem. And so those two different mental models just solve different problems. It isn't that one's better than the other, right? It's just they're different. Your outcomes are different, and that's how that works. And the point to connect that with education, I think you shouldn't try to hope that the current Platonic form that education squeezes reality through is meant to solve or serve your outcomes. And so if you have different outcomes, you should look at, quote unquote, educating yourself through a different Platonic form and not try to use the Platonic form that's presented to you, which is the formal education system, to do it. And the thing is, the formal education system, that Platonic form, is very easy to see how that's useful, right? As a parent that has clear benefits in terms of childcare, there's some childcare component to education, right? There's some standardization component to education in terms of a populace. There's some, it's very easy to see how traditional education serves many, many outcomes in a, if not optimal, more than satisfactory way. But the thing is, those were formulated. So one, the outcomes are different. That was also formulated in a different kind of a stage of tech evolution, right? There was no internet. There was no, traditional education doesn't, you could hack on the internet to kind of traditional education, but the idea of education wasn't really born in kind of a digital age. And so what I would say is, rather than get frustrated at the Platonic form that's given to you and maybe is widespread and everybody knows that, okay, so education is you go to school and that's the standard thing. I think you should maybe not discard that per se, because in certain places you are forced to take part in education, but you should put that aside and look for other ways to squeeze reality through. And it might be that the way to squeeze the educational Platonic form that works best for you is, okay, how do I get good at selecting and using mental models that are useful to me to achieve some outcome? And again, this is in the modern media environment, which is itself has a whole bunch of different, it's like learning to be good at Google, right? So you need to, a lot of education, or at least, success in various fields, is being able to search for things well on the internet. And in the same way, right, it might be that, the next evolution of education, or the Platonic form of education that's most useful to you as an individual, outside of these other kind of outcomes that the traditional education serves, like, the things that the state needs and things that parents need and things like that. Maybe it might be that, part of that formulation is you need to be really good at searching for mental models that are useful to you. Just like you're searching for a web page that's useful to you to solve some problem that you have at work or school or whatever, right? The modern form of education should be getting good at searching. Obviously there's no search engine for it, but figuring out how to search for mental models that are useful to you, given that there are a whole bunch out there. And so the thing is, it's easy to see, and I also was frustrated by education before, but I think once you realize that, okay, it's one Platonic form, it might not be the best Platonic form for you. It might not be the one that you are accustomed to or serves your needs. That's fine. Okay, let's look for another one. And how do we come up with one given the way that reality is evolving, right, with technology and stuff like that? And so, I guess the TLDR is that there might be a tendency to kind of assign a more malicious or malevolent,
for sure,
kind of sinister motivation behind education, but I think it's just a different Platonic form used by a different person towards a different outcome.
And in fact, so it's like assuming malice, right? That itself is a very
exactly.
Seductive and simplified approach to thinking
Exactly.
about complex systems. And it's very, very enticing to people, right? Like, who is the bad guy who is out to screw us? Like, is once you look at it, oh yeah, it's so when you start thinking, how am I assuming that there's some bad guy out to screw me or whatever? And it's like, yeah, reality is almost always more complex. And looking for points of intervention and seeing just see, I mean, again, it depends on, again, like I don't know how generalizing helps here, but like, so it varies from, so I've had a lot of different conversations with different people about these things, and often people are stuck because they're stressed about something or they're upset and they're swept up in. And when I reflect on my own life, like I remember in my teens, while I was in school and after I was in school, for a long time I was like kind of angry, like, oh, why did the system screw me like this or didn't serve me better? And then I was like, hold on, oh yeah, it couldn't do better than what it tried. Or it's like, oh, the odds of, it's like, so if I could be honest with a young person, I would say things like, well, yeah, like what you just said, basically, it's like, so it's like kind of a legacy issues, right? Basically, right? It was a product of a different time, and there people are trying their best, but it's not good enough, and the cost of changing is very high, and we are witnessing things change, but it's not, the system is so large, and I mean,
and you should just look for a different frame that helps you.
Yeah, you should find. I mean, so even discussing in great detail precisely, like, something every so often you got to pause and ask yourself, like, if we go down this path of asking why precisely is the education system the way it is, you're like, wait, stop, do we actually want to spend the next hour of this conversation doing that? Or are you upset because
finding a different model that helps you? Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, by the way, my Zoom, I'm on my Zoom account that doesn't have
I see.
the thing. So I'm gonna stop the call here, and then we'll go to WhatsApp. I'll edit out this last like 1 minute, this 30 seconds or whatever, and then I'll
Sounds
start the
good.
recording and we'll stitch that.
Okay.
Just press stop. Yeah, I'll stitch.
Yeah, it's actually super interesting because this whole conversation about education, it's itself so emblematic of the stuff we've talked about. We have this Platonic form that we're super used to, that is socially acceptable and socially well known, that we over-index on because it's such a visceral experience. And the thing to do is just realize that, okay, if there's this underlying reality and there are like a ton of different ways that you can squeeze it through, right? We should just forget about worrying about the current formulation or frame or Platonic form or mental model that we use for education, and just seek out a new one that tech evolution allows us, that serves our outcomes better. And so, it's funny because it's the meta thing about education itself is that it evolves and there are stages and you make it better, right? And so education itself, if you take it to be selecting the right Platonic forms and using them to achieve outcomes, that can be applied to the concept of education itself, which is just a Platonic form that we over-index on and we're used to and we think is the only way, right? And it's funny.
Yeah, so one of the things that was playing out in my head was that there is in the multiverse or whatever, there's a version of this conversation that can play out for some people where they're passionate about education or whatever, and they just follow the questions like, oh, it's a problem, yeah, what should we do about it? And then there's, oh, what could we do about it? Oh, we could, like, what's the problem really? And like, there needs to be reform in this thing. And then if you don't pause from time to time to ask yourself what you're really doing, like, you can just end up like, by responding back and forth in this very path dependent way, next thing you know, like, oh, both of us have decided that we're going to lobby the Ministry of Education or something and present a new syllabus, or like, just and like, while that's a kind of fictitious example, a lot of people do live their lives where in that kind of unquestioned just one thing leading to another, and that's just kind of, so with my friend and their dating issues, like, it's kind of the same thing. Like, you start with some frame, and then like again, the ultra tricky thing about frames is that you can't see that you're inside. Like what you see is you cannot see the boundaries of your frame. That's the and that's like you have to be humble about it, because the moment you think, oh, I'm a guy who talks to people about frames, therefore I understand frames, therefore like you still always can't see the boundaries of your frames. So it's like you have to, I don't know, does that trigger anything for you?
Yeah, actually, to tie this back to the thing I said last week, you just mentioned that, okay, so some people might end up lobbying, say, Congress, or lobbying your Ministry of Education or whatever to change it. What I would add to that is, the thing is, each individual is themselves this infinitely complex person with their own edge and handicap. And, what I would do is, I would be hesitant to project my edge and handicap, which might be, thinking about this stuff or being really good, comfortable with looking at YouTube videos, onto somebody, a platonic form that will help them, right? So the only judgment you can make is the platonic form doesn't help me. Not that the platonic form they are expressing or, pursuing doesn't help them, right? And there's this, I don't know if you caught the latest Dave Chappelle piece on Netflix. Yeah, it's about this. They were renaming some School of the Arts auditorium after him. And, without giving away the punchline for those who haven't watched it, he expressed a very strong preference, and his strong kind of ethos around freedom of artistic freedom and expression, right? The freedom to express yourself, the freedom to do art. What I would say is there's a very interesting parallel there, in that I'd say art and philosophy is really concerned about, they're concerned with the parts of reality that we don't have good, clear platonic forms for, right? And so the thing is, right, if you restrict expression of, so art and art is kind of what his domain is, but if you just broaden that out a little bit more to restricting the different ways of distilling reality into platonic forms. And sure, one way, and back to our education example, one way might be that education is about selecting platonic forms and getting better at them. Another form might be, okay, this formalized classroom-based education. Another form might be this thing that they are lobbying Congress to improve on. What I would be hesitant to do is, just like Dave Chappelle is, the primacy of his argument, there's primacy around freedom to express yourself. I'd say that also needs to be freedom to squeeze reality through different platonic forms, because you don't know what you don't know. And you might be expressing reality in a new way towards somebody else's ends that then is revolutionary in a way that you can't guess, right? I mean, that's the whole point of all of this. You need to be humble in terms of how reality can be squeezed into different platonic forms and what outcomes those could achieve, right? The only confidence you have is really your own very local understanding of outcomes and benefits and edges and handicaps. You can't really say that somebody else, unless there's kind of an overt malice or overt harm that is doing, you don't really want to prevent people from expressing or finding other platonic forms for reality that serve their ends, because at the end of the day, they might have something that evolves to something that's more useful for more people, that's useful for yourself. And there's a parallel here to, again, Dave Chappelle wanting freedom of artistic expression, or kind of artistic freedom, because you want to allow the generation of new platonic forms as the world evolves, right? As you come up with new technology and stuff like that, you don't want to project your needs, outcomes, edges, handicaps on other people and how they want to express the platonic form. You just want a wide selection of different forms to choose from, discussion about them, right? Just like how comedy or art is the freedom of artistic expression. There's still an arbiter. The arbiter at the end of the day is the audience, right? In the case of comedy. So, and in the piece, he says, don't criticize my, what was the piece? His last kind of stand-up special. He's like, just be better than me, right? Come up with a better, have more talent and express it and you'll win me. And in the same way, you should allow for different platonic forms to proliferate and have them win in the marketplace of outcomes or ideas.
Yeah, it's funny. It's reminding me of I once had a thread where I kind of surprised myself with the conclusion where I didn't know where I was going with it, but just kind of thinking about American political, not just politics, but just American style of conversation and doing things and screwing around. And like one of the things that Americans do is they're very playful. And again, playful is my framing on that, but like they're very irreverent. I think some people say irreverent. So you contrast it with like in Thailand, like if you make fun of the king, like that's it's not only is it offensive, you can get arrested. Like it's just like this, the idea of it is because they associate the monarchy with the pride of the country. Is completely different frame from America, where it's like it's a time honored tradition that you make fun of the president and you make fun of all those people, authority, and they did like, so the thing I was laughing at was that there's a tradition of like mocking, not even mocking, even the way they celebrate their leaders or whatever. Like they make these very cringe, childish, silly like paintings or memes or whatever of their political leaders. And then, but the funny thing is, because they have such a high tolerance for what I jokingly describe as nonsense, and there's a lot of nonsense, that percolation allows for periodically like some genius ideas to come out. And so it's almost like, to allow the generation of genius, it seems that you have to tolerate noise and stupidity or cringe or whatever. And like, so you have to be a bit shameless. And like, no one is more shameless than Americans. Like, if you look at a global, and I've heard from people in the UK and people in Australia. So, from like an Asian perspective, maybe like, oh, is it like Westerners? But no, even like, so Australians, for example, famously have, like, they complain about how they have like what's it, the tall poppy syndrome, or like just people who try risky things. Like just the US has this celebrate mavericks idea, right? And it's just so like what Dave Chappelle is complaining about, and I think he's like the canary in a coal mine in a way. Like he's perceiving because he's at the cutting edge of what he does, so he can perceive things that are going on there that it's roughly like the US is like that relative to the rest of the world, in a way. And that's part of why people fleeing religious persecution and other things, they flee to the US to go and try and make it, because they feel that, and they're willing to tolerate, whether it's gun violence, or they weigh the risks, and they're like, yeah, it's still worth going to the States because opportunity is there. Because, and yeah, that's just, I guess, so that's half of what I want to say. The other half is, I guess, part of the tricky thing about discussing tolerance and incitement to violence or whatever is that there are the common sense stuff where I think everyone can more or less agree that it's fine, and then there's the contentious stuff where people disagree, that they have overlapping, their frames clash on what is or is not incitement to violence, for example, or what is or is not like a thought that I had recently was that, I'm just jumping from thing to thing, but like a thought I had recently was, all social behavior is contagious to some degree, right? You hear someone speak, you can pick up their mannerisms. You see something on the timeline, like social behavior is contagious. There's this whole, I think Peter Thiel is a big fan of Gerardian mimesis. It's whatever, like it's just a bunch of ways of just talking about people imitating other people, and especially that we've just lived through a pandemic, and you realize that if behaviors are contagious, that has a bunch of implications that's not very there can be some strange and implications that are outside the frame of conventional what is acceptable to discuss. And it actually, just thinking about the fact that behavior is contagious, I think helped me understand like conservative perspectives a bit more. Like, so I consider myself very I'm very good at messing around with frames. I can entertain ideas that are quote unquote unhealthy, and I'll pretty much be fine with it. But realizing that social behaviors are contagious, I think you can almost think of some forms of conservative thinking or approach to life as being very cautious about mimetic contagion. Like you're like, in the cliche version of that is like you're afraid that your kids are going to become like spoiled, quote unquote, spoiled by bad influences or whatever, and then they're gonna run away from home and do crazy shit. And then you'd be like, oh, it's because they watch that movie or something. I mean, that's the concern. And it's not an entire, it's not an illegitimate concern, and just do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, actually, the thing is, these themselves are frames, right, or platonic forms, right? So the idea that artistic freedom, artistic expression, allowing everybody to do what they want is a platonic form that once it touches reality, right, the actual reality, again, infinitely complex, and that doesn't model reality perfectly, because the people who do have families, if you have kids, if you are running a government, right, or monarchy or whatever, the thing is, at the end of the day, you have to deal with the parts of reality that leak out of your model. And so it's easy for Dave Chappelle to say it because he's a comedian. He doesn't have to deal with the parts of reality that leak out. I mean, again, it's not that one is right or wrong. They're different platonic forms to serve different outcomes, and you need to kind of manipulate different platonic forms to do different things, right? And so it's not, I wouldn't even say that, it's very difficult to say that the Thai approach to it is wrong, quote unquote, right? They have an outcome that the Thai, king's approach to being really strict about. You can't really say it's wrong, or it doesn't serve a particular outcome, but it serves another outcome, right? The American system serves one outcome. It doesn't serve potentially another, different outcomes. And as you can see that maybe the pandemic requires you to be maybe more, sacrifice a few of your kind of needs or rights or whatever, right? So that's still an ongoing debate. But the point is that it's just, you have these different lenses, and you're watching the same scene play out. But the Americans chose one lens, the Thai king chose a different lens. You still have this underlying crazy, infinitely complex reality of humans getting together and doing stuff and living and not killing one another, right? So I'd say that it's very difficult to have any kind of value judgment on any of those approaches, except to say that you yourself have outcomes, you yourself should. Where you might draw the line is, and I think this happens in Thailand, if you say you insult the king or whatever, that has a physical repercussion on you. So you might want to, I can see drawing the line there where, okay, yeah, having some physical, you're limiting me in some physical way. Your platonic form is limiting me in some physical way, right? But as long as it doesn't do that, you should allow anybody to choose the platonic form they want for their own context. Right. And so it's just to say that it's very difficult to have some value judgment on the way that other people decide to choose different platonic forms. The only thing you can do is be clear on what is my objective, what am I trying to do, and make sure that in a lot of cases, you want to allow the flourishing of different platonic forms and different ways of viewing it, because there might be some part of reality you're missing that they are capturing in a way that you can't predict.
Right. And here, I think what I would want to kind of gesture to people who are watching, right, it's like, again, it's like when we think about, when we offer kind of generalized suggestions about what is allowed and not allowed, and then we're talking about, American perspectives and Thai perspectives, conservatives, liberals. I'm like, those are very big things. And the thing, I think it's always, a helpful heuristic for me is to always come back to yourself and like what you have direct influence over. So your friends, your peers, people that you interact with, and like who's to say what is like the ideal way to govern a society. But like we are not governing societies, right? We have influence over our immediate social graphs. And so like my recommendation to my friends or the people who like watch my videos regularly is like, okay, like that you have some set of frames and your friends have some set of frames, and like if you might not be able to reform your entire society, but I wouldn't think that far ahead anyway. Like, and I used to spend a lot of time thinking, how do we reform society? I'm like, can you reform, can you get together like a dozen people who are thoughtful and have conversations and help each other see where your respective blind spots are? Because even doing that is like this one friend helping another friend see their blind spot, like with my friend in dating or whatever the thing in employment, like, oh, I can't get a promotion. Do you really want a promotion, or have you considered like all those things? Like if we help people think about individual frames. And I think, and I've sensed that, so again, like in the mainstream discourse, and again, like why are we talking about mainstream discourse? Just really quickly, there's a sense of, oh, like mainstream Western pop culture, not pop culture, like just culture, right? Like they atomize systemic failings, meaning, oh, the world's going to shit, but like, so you should go to therapy as an individual, or you should recycle, and like there is something about overly reducing everything down atomistically to what an individual can do. But actually, there's like, and that's too binary, right? Like either it's like you lobby at government level stuff, or you do work on things as individuals. But I think like all of the interesting alpha or potential or whatever, like where you can do interesting things, is in the kind of small social realm where like a dozen people, I think, have collective capacity. And that's what startups are, right? In a sense, you get together a group of people who can think. Was that another, am I once again reinventing another Peter Thiel idea? I think he said something like, a startup is like the smallest group of people who believe something different that can create. Anyway, it doesn't really matter, right? It's just this sense of we can independently recreate the realization that, okay, if we experiment with frames and we tolerate experimentation with frames, that should free. I mean, you can't guarantee that it'll lead to good outcomes, but it expands the range of possible outcomes.
Yeah, I guess the simple way that I approach this thing is that, I mean, conversations like this is, sure, we might talk about, say, different cultures and their approaches to individualism or not, but all of that is just in service of what I consider a new iteration of the idea of education, which is just that there's a under discussion or under representation of this idea that all you're doing is Platonic forms, right? It's mental models all the way down. And where these conversations are useful is to introduce these concepts into, say, even local social graphs, the people who watch this video. And so I don't have any broader objective or hope for these things other than seed a new Platonic form for how we educate ourselves, because it just feels that the current way education works is not serving a lot of outcomes or a lot of functions that people want. And so all these conversations are just to stitch together the idea that, okay, education maybe should really just be about, or the foundation of education should be about the selection and using of the right mental models for in your own life to achieve some outcome.
Right. And we can,
and all the, yeah. And I mean, everything touches this. You see that, how you see the world, how different societies organize, all of those are based on Platonic forms, right? And so if examples, the kind of examples you go through when you're trying to do this very simple thing about injecting a new way of thinking about education, which is this idea around mental models and their uses, their limitations and stuff like that, you actually touch on, I mean, everything, because everything is based on this idea. Like, so it's unsurprising that we touch on stuff that has no realistic implication or expectation of changing it. But all of this is useful to, kind of just broaden the idea or kind of have exemplify the things that we're talking about.
Yeah. I would describe it as like, again, to go back to the frame example, it's like to teach, if you're going to teach someone about camera frames, like, and as a filmmaker, you show them a microscope, you show them a binoculars, a telescope, and even a deep space telescope, and like, you're not going to use those tools like, you're not going to whatever, but it's just to get you to expand your mind about what is possible, and then you choose the tools that suit you, right? And so I guess if there's one thing that I can nudge people towards, and myself as well, right, it's just to question, and even so, questioning the frames that you're using might be slightly self-defeating, because you're still going to ask yourself questions within the frame of the set of questions that you're familiar with. And so it's really, I think, screwing around, right? Just deliberately inverting things or asking. And I think there's a bunch of questions that are worth experimenting with in a lot of domains. Like, what if we didn't do it? Or what if we did it the other way around? Or what if we did it 10 times more? What if we try to do it faster, slower? What if,
Yeah, my TLDR of all of this is, if my only hope, and I guess the foundation of all education is just curiosity, is just to help people internalize the idea that, okay, the only tools I have for interacting with reality is these mental models. They are flawed in such fundamental ways, and they're limited in such fundamental ways, and they reduce dimensionality in so many flawed ways that once you internalize that, the default stance to everything becomes curiosity. And I think that is the answer, right? The only answer to all of this, or the only takeaway that you can have fundamentally, is the fact that, okay, my default stance is that I don't know. And so I ask questions, or, just once you internalize that curiosity, a lot of stuff gets unlocked, I feel.
Yeah. And so even just, knowing that there's stuff outside the frame, right? Like, and then, but you don't know what it is. And, you might read a book about what's outside your frame, but even then it's like, you have to, I think it's like almost like
it's models all the way down.
Yeah, it's like adventurer spirit, I think, is part of it. And I'm just remembering that some people asked in the last video, this is a bit of a tonal shift maybe, but some people were asking about happiness, and I just want to spend a few minutes talking about that. And I think like we can kind of segue to it by talking about frames as well, because I do mention both topics in my book. And it's like, even thinking about feelings and how you feel what you feel and what you want to feel, like all of these are, we don't realize that we inherit the ideas about these things. So things like, I'm feeling job dissatisfaction, or I'm feeling, even that, I think, again, it depends on who you're talking to. So there's this whole spectrum. And like, I do find that this is one thing where my audience, right? So my audience are like nerds, curious people in general, but like there's a huge spectrum of emotional awareness. Like some people don't even think to question their like emotional reality, and some people have quite nuanced understandings of their feelings. But have you had conversations with people, curious nerds, about happiness? Right? So I guess how I would frame this question, right? So in our previous conversation, we talked about how to win, and then one of the things we ended up with, winning doesn't necessarily make you happy. And I just wanted a few minutes from Dinesh about happiness and what makes you happy.
Yeah, I guess the thing I would add to that is just that so winning isn't happiness. And I mean, this is probably kind of everybody, the way everybody looks at a thing is a projection of kind of their own mental models. And this is probably a bit of a projection of mine, but I feel like it's more useful to look at happiness as kind of an outcome that you're trying to achieve, just like your other outcomes. So it's just a chemical state of your brain that you're trying to get, right? So we happen to be animals. We happen to have, some neural chemistry that gives us emotions. And so happiness is one of those things that you have to achieve, because I mean, if you're not, then you are, you can't function, you're depressed, and it has all these negative outcomes. So it's not like some kind of, normative, amazing, philosophical thing that we're trying to achieve, right? I just look at it as the mechanics of, okay, so there's some mechanics of being happy. And, there's a lot of literature about this in terms of, okay, actually, a lot of happiness is just dependent on some initial neurochemical state that you have been born with. And so actually your happiness, you can kind of make it oscillate around some base state. But, the maybe unfair reality is that a lot of us are just born with different base states. And so, it's very difficult to come up with context independent. I found that it's difficult to come up with context independent models of happiness, because it's just, we know so little about this. And the thing is, the person I'm speaking to could have a different initial base state that if I say, hey, why aren't you happy about this thing or whatever, right? It might just make no sense, because the way they see the world is just different because of that initial state. And all of that is not because of some intellectual pursuit. It's just you start with some neural chemistry, some brain chemistry that you can't get out of. I mean, you can alter it with, say, drugs or whatever, but, again, that's a different kind of sphere, right? If you're just trying to, you can't intellectualize it away. You can't think it away. You can't come up with a new perspective or platonic form to make I mean, you can to some extent, but I think that there's a deep neurochemical component that you can't run away from. So that's one thing I would add, that you have to, any chat about happiness needs to acknowledge the fact that there's so much of it that's grounded some kind of biochemical reality that you can't escape from. Okay, once you have that though, I think there's enough examples of how do you improve that base state by as much as you can. Morgan Housel writes about this. He writes about money. He has this book, The Psychology of Money, and the series. He writes about it quite a bit. And he talks about money. But the thing is, because money is so intimately linked to happiness, there are a lot of lessons there about how to be happy, right? And kind of your material needs are also very intimately linked to happiness. And so it's very difficult to separate those. And so there's a lot of stuff in there about how, I think Charlie Munger said this, the best way to be happy is just to have low expectations. And, that sounds like, haha, a billionaire saying that, but there's some innate truth to that. And if you connect the dots between what he says and what Morgan Housel said, there's a lot of stuff there about how your expectation is such a huge part of how happy you end up. And also I think there's this TED talk by maybe Dan Gilbert about how you can synthesize happiness. And, actually synthesized happiness is like the same as real happiness. And so there's a lot of stuff there about how you can not trick yourself, but if you think in certain ways and you understand certain things about yourself, you can synthesize happiness in a certain way. So, okay, I'd say there's some base, the brain chemistry, you can't run away from that. Then on top of that, you have some mental stuff you can do in terms of expectations and understanding this stuff. The last part I would add on to this, I guess, is the things that, there's a lot of stuff in the classics or even in Certo about how there's some fundamental things that you want to get right. And you could even, again, Charlie Munger says this thing about invert, right? To find out the answer, invert it. So what makes you unhappy? If you have bad relationships, that's going to make you unhappy. If you have bad health, that's going to make you unhappy. So just make sure you get these check boxes checked.
Yeah.
Stay in good health, get good relationships, right? Have some kind of fulfillment. And I think, that's as far as I would go in terms of any kind of advice I'd give about happiness. That's kind of all you can do. And, there's this whole layer that's added on by society in terms of, status and wealth. And I mean, there's already a lot of literature about how those ultimately don't really work out. But it's useful to keep in mind that is tangential at best and sometimes even distracting to getting happy.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a thing where, ironically, it's like people who, so it's a little bit of an info hazard or whatever, where if you start obsessing about it and you're trying very hard to get as happy as possible or whatever, like that can actually make you, so it's just as being secret of happiness being low expectations. Like if you start expecting more and more progress or in that domain, like that can be kind of counterproductive. And even these things we can talk about in terms of frames, right? So having low expectations is a kind of frame, and just
exactly
experiment with how you have been processing your feelings and your assumptions about what's going to happen or whatnot. Like, yeah, and I do think that from time to time when I feel overwhelmed or dissatisfied or whatever, like I have a photograph of myself when I was a kid reading a book, and then I tweeted taking a moment to appreciate that I am in fact living my childhood dream. We made it, kid. Like, and I forget about it sometimes. I have a screenshot printed out, and just remembering that, oh yeah, this is what I wanted when I was a child, and I have it, and like that, like re-inhabiting that. So I guess it's gratitude, right? So like a lot of people say that gratitude is like tested, proven to make people feel better. Like just remembering, because it boils down to what you're focusing on. Because you can always focus on, I'm not making as much, I don't have as much YouTube traffic this month compared to last month, or whatever it is. And those can be useful things to think about, but also, yeah, it's really about what you choose to focus on. And even so, you were mentioning like stoicism and like that too is a kind of framing skill set. Like, eventually we'll all be dead, so no need to be obsessed about other things. And yeah, I mean, people I think talk about this stuff more, but in general it's probably not discussed enough, just because the very traditional markers of happiness
are still what kind of dominate typical conversations. I mean, the fact that the media celebrates, just look at who the media celebrates. The media doesn't celebrate the people with low expectations.
Right.
The media celebrates the billionaire or the,
Right.
the fundraise or whatever, right? And again, it's not to say that's good or bad. That's just a different form to achieve a different outcome. And you just need to be careful to
Right.
adopt the platonic form that serves your outcomes. And at the end of the day, it's just that if you're not feeling a desired emotion, if you're not happy, right, happy quote unquote, or if you're not feeling that your outcome is achieved, just be curious, okay, there might be another platonic form out there that I can adopt a different lens, a different way of looking at the scene, maybe zoomed in or zoomed out or whatever,
Right.
that will help me achieve that outcome. And that it should be just the default state, that curiosity.
Oh, and this brings me back to what you were saying about where your edge is, which is that, again, like you have to find, like, the trophy finish is 0.00 negligible part of what it is to be an athlete, and like getting a publishing book deal or being on the bestseller list, or the wedding day compared to the day life of marriage. Like, it's just, yeah, and like all the photo cutting ribbon moments are very highly prominent on the socials, but like you should find the things that you enjoy without like extrinsic kind of reward and validation and whatever, and there's always some, maybe.
Yeah, and it really ties down to the fact that, again, the models that are optimized for spreading are the ones that spread. The photo finish is the one that is the model that spreads. And it's just it's almost criminal, right? That the model about, low expectations never gets to you because that isn't sexy, or that isn't what, the media, it's really crazy, right? It's really this tragedy, and it's really under discussed.
Yeah, I think my friend once said something like, "Oh, there's like a Greek uncle just sitting by the beach, playing with his grandkid, and he's like, he is the happiest man on earth, and like, but nobody's interested in learning from him because he's just an uncle." Right?
Exactly.
And yeah,
his story doesn't spread.
Yeah, which is, yeah, it's just something to reflect on, I guess. Like, and yeah, I mean, I think some people think that, okay, when you're younger, you have more leeway to make mistakes, I guess, and like take bold, big risks to try and do ambitious things. And then if it doesn't work out, you can still kind of mellow out as you get older. I think there's some truth to that. I think, what do you think about that?
I mean, it's true. I'd say that. I mean, it's just that as you get older, I think what the great benefit that age gives you is you are more familiar and you have more confidence about what your age is, right? You know what you're good at, you know what is played to you, you know what is worked to you, and you can model your life in an appropriate way. I think when you're younger, you are less certain about that, right? And so you're still experimenting with okay, so what is my brain wiring like? You don't really know that. You haven't tested that, right? You haven't tested that against reality. As you get older, you know those things, and so you are more confident about selecting the models that work for you, for your brain wiring, right? And so the thing is, I think that's the great advantage that kind of age has. And if you are younger, I think what you want to do is try to accelerate that process, try to find out what your age will, and have reality kind of tell you that.
Yeah. Yeah, and also even just living through more life experience, I guess, like seeing, it's even, being very sick at some point, or being very, just the fluctuations of life, and like seeing people leaving their jobs, people getting married, getting divorced, whatever. Like, just you get to witness more cycle, like going through a pandemic, right? You get to see how you feel about, like, it's just,
I mean, I think there's some part of that is out of your control, right? So you can't like induce a pandemic, but I think just having the lens that what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to understand what my age is helps, even if you can't necessarily accelerate that to any meaningful degree. Even just having that lens as you're experiencing things, I think helps to accelerate kind of articulating that for yourself.
Yeah. Okay, it looks like my Zoom has 2 minutes left. So any closing thoughts?
No, I mean, I'd say that, the purpose of all these things are really just curiosity, right? Just to help people internalize.
Oh, you froze.
say, or yeah, that's what everybody says, that you should be curious, or start with a beginner's mind.
Sorry,
Right? I think the key is just to really
you froze on my end.
Yeah.
You said help people internalize curiosity.
help people internalize curiosity, because
Yeah.
at the end of the day, I mean, it might be something that you hear that's a nice
Right.
thing that people say, sure, I should be curious, start with a
Yeah.
beginner's mind. You know, the hope is that this tells you why that's how reality is. Your
Oh, you know-
default stance has to be curiosity.
Yeah, this is an amazing challenge. It's only 1 minute, but like I've told people before that you are the first person I've ever met who actually was genuinely curious about why things that I did was working or not working. Like, so normally when like parents or teachers say, oh, why didn't you do a thing? They're not really curious to know the answer. They're just more looking for a performance of contrition. And you were like, no, why? And I'm like, oh yeah, you know, I'm a terrible person. And you're like, but why? And just experiencing that energy, I think I found it very healing, even psychologically, emotionally. Like, oh, I don't need to be upset and scared or whatever. I can actually just think about what's going on. And exposing people to that energy, I think, is very, very valuable. So we'll keep
because that's the only way to be, right? There isn't any other way, right?
Right. Okay, I'll end it so that it doesn't cut us off halfway. Thanks.
All right, sounds good.
I'll upload
Okay.
it. Yeah, let's see how it goes.
All right, have a good night.